Hello, everyone. This is the New World Geopolitics March 3rd update for the Russo-Ukrainian War. The dynamics for the front line have once again shifted, so we have a number of developments to cover, including Russian progress in Novomyk and Ivanivka, as well as Ukrainian counterattacks finally occurring in the Avdiivka area in an attempt to stabilize that situation. So let's go ahead and dive into the front, actually to the Seversk area first. Where we've seen reports of Russian movement and attempts to break into Bilogorovka. So far, these attempts have failed, but there is, some pretty strong Russian attacks in this direction. I've marked the changes in the front line as margin, or not as marginal, but as speculative, because we really don't know exactly what's going on here. This is kind of really the only kind of mapping update we've got from anywhere, and it's not from very solid sources, but there are Russian attacks in this direction. Now we are going to move on to the Bakhmut Ivanivka direction, where we have seen some the situation develop very poorly for Ukraine. Russia has seized the middle of the village, and now the main supply road for Ukraine into the village has been cut here in the north. In addition to that, the Russians have also crossed one of the supply roads leading into town in the south. The situation's gotten significantly worse for Ukraine. Russia controls over half of the village now, so we'll see what goes on there. I expect that the main Russian effort's going to continue in this direction, and if Ivanivka falls, we could see a lot of these Ukrainian defenses to the south that are actually east of the canal collapse as well. So we'll keep you guys updated on that. Moving on to the Avdiivka sector, we actually have evidence of the first Ukrainian counterattacks that have managed to counterattack in both Berdichi and Tonenke, actually regaining some ground in both places. The main part of Berdichi seems to be under Ukrainian control now. There were some battles in this area here. Let's actually put everything on. There's a cemetery in town, so the Russians had made it as far as the cemetery at one point, but there's some video evidence of the Ukrainian troops pushing back into town, specifically of a Bradley fighting vehicle on around this area, firing on and destroying Russian units in this direction here. So counterattacks to the north, counterattacks to the south, which has kind of put Orlovka in some kind of a salient, I guess you can say. I'm not exactly sure if Ukraine is going to be able to push back into Orlovka as well. It's a little bit more defensible because of the water barriers for the Russians, but we'll have to kind of wait and see what's going on here. It's very possible that the Ukrainian army could just be attacking in these directions here in order to buy time for the destruction of a defensive line further in the rear. Either that or the Ukrainians have a bit more strength than we've estimated, and they plan on holding the line currently around Semenivka. So that's something we're going to have to wait for further developments on. And we're going to talk a little bit further about what the Russians are doing here at the end, so that's all kind of going to come together. Moving down to Novelske, we have more evidence of Russian attacks. Basically, they've seized most of the Ukrainian positions on the outskirts of the small settlement. I expect the Russians to continue in this direction in order to attempt to put Krasnogorovka into an operational environment. So I don't think this will be one of the places that Russia slackens off in. Talking about Krasnogorovka, there's some recent footage of 3rd Azov Brigade was redeployed to the area in order to counterattack and push the Russians out of town. They released some video footage of them doing just that, and they claim that the Russians have been completely pushed out of town. However, to me, it seems like the video, unless I'm geolocating it wrong, takes place somewhere a little bit further north of where we thought the original Russians had made it, where we'd plotted them as being. So still no real evidence that they've been completely forced out of town there. So we'll wait for further updates on that coming up in the future. Now, moving a little bit more to the south, we have reports that the Russians have continued advancing towards Grigorovka, capturing this residential area here in between Grigorovka and Marinka. This, in addition to some reported Russian attacks in these areas in between the lakes to the north, don't have anything that we can actually update or verify on the map there. So maybe we'll have an update on that coming out in the future. And then moving a little bit further south to Novomyk, we have an update on Russian progress. The Russians are now fighting for the center of the settlement. So really, let's go back and look at an overall strategic view of the front line. We have seen somewhat of a diminished probing of the front line coming from the Russian side. Less information about random probing attacks in areas that we typically don't see Russian activity. More so, Russian activity has been concentrated on the offensive near Bakhmut, on the offensive south of Donetsk, and then on the defensive in the Avdiivka area, at least over the last few days. So I expect, the Russians perhaps maybe have learned what they want to learn from the probing of the front line, and have decided to focus their resources on these three areas, or maybe this was just a quick burst of Ukrainian power on the front line that might dissipate in the next few days, where the Russians will continue what they're doing. It's hard to say. This is that crucial phase where we're actually going to see what kind of fight the Ukrainian army has left in them and exactly how deep the cracks are. So it really could go either way. Of course, I have no idea. Not on the ground. I don't know the strength of the Ukrainian army. I can only make assumptions based on what we're seeing on the front line. And it appears like we're at that stage where it could be either way. We really don't know. So moving on, I kind of want to talk about some other topics that I want to cover involving Western countries. Now, keep in mind, when it comes to politics, I have a generally very good understanding of power structures and how politics work in general, but I'm somewhat less familiar with the EU, so take what I'm saying with a grain of salt here. From my observational standpoint, it seems that there are two major driving forces in the EU right now: the Ukraine war and climate politics seem to be two big ones. And there's some other various things going on. I think that at the moment, the Ukraine war isn't having any kind of direct, devastating effects on the ruling coalition of the EU, but rather an indirect effect, and climate change politics appears to be having a direct negative modifier, a direct negative impact on the ruling coalition. So both cases actually involve farming. Now, as many of you know, in the past few years, there has been massive farmer protests across Europe, and they have actually scaled up significantly in the last few months. The reasons for this are twofold. One, climate protection laws are making nitrogen-based fertilizers either more expensive or less available. Either way, this results in lower crop yields, higher costs, and lower incomes for the farming community. And that's kind of the case with the Netherlands, right, when we first started seeing the farm protests pop up. Second, dirt cheap agricultural products flooding in from Ukraine are tanking market prices, lowering farm profits even more. So this is actually a process you learn about in international economics. It's called dumping. It's considered fairly hostile. In the past, the term has primarily been associated with China or Saudi Arabia per se. Essentially a foreign country with cheaper goods does exactly what you're seeing. They flood the market with the cheap goods, and they knock down the prices in order to eliminate any kind of competition. That way in the future they can raise the prices back up and make a profit. So like in the case of Saudi Arabia, for example, this is recent and verifiable. At the beginning of the US shale revolution in the early 2010s, massive oil reserves were brought online in America through the process that we know as fracking. These wells were only profitable at $100 price point for for oil, so it was a relatively new technology. A lot of investment had to go in to get them running, so the upfront cost was high, the profit margin was very slim. So what Saudi Arabia did was they noticed the threat to their own market, and they increased production dramatically, and dropped their prices in an effort to put U.S. shale fields out of business. So basically, the Saudis and the OPEC cartel made a move to basically price the U.S. shale market out, and just completely put them out of business. This effort actually caused a minor recession in America, I believe in 2012 time period. It was kind of like associated with the not with the 2008 financial crisis, but there was a secondary recession wave that hit on the back end of that, and the hits to shale production were a big part of that. The shale, one of the things with that particular case is shale technology was making major and quick breakthroughs, and they actually did not collapse, and they managed to lower the price dramatically, actually to the point where U.S. shale is comparable in upfront and the investment cost that the Saudi oil fields are. So, they made it through and survived in that case. So in the case of Europe, the establishment EU support for Ukraine is actually working counterproductively for their own re-election. Because there's no real technological breakthroughs that you can make with food production, right? Here is the projection of the elections in June. First, looking at the current parliament, you basically have a centrist majority with a heavy left lean between the leading EPP party, which is actually center-right. This is Ursula von der Leyen's party, the Socialist and Democrats party, and then the Liberal Renew Europe party. But all three parties and the influential Green Party are looking to lose large number of seats to the conservative ECR, and then the ID, which is the far right party, I guess you could say. This is where my knowledge of EU politics is somewhat lacking. The EPP will still be the largest party in Parliament, and could potentially rebuild a coalition, just include other factions in it to prevent the EU from going too far right. This is more likely if the elections have closer margins, but if it turns out to be worse than the projections, we could see a more center-right leaning government in Europe between the EPP, the ID, and the ECR parties. So, that's something to look forward to, and that could have some major effects on some things in Europe. Probably not support for Ukraine per se, but certainly allowing product dumping for agricultural goods, and potentially more conservative approach to funding for the war, more checks and balances on the kind of support that's sent and whatnot. So I think in the next video I will touch on American election and politics some after the Frontline update. That way I could kind of lay the groundwork with a little bit of information here and there for a more detailed solo report if you guys are interested in it on Western politics. And I can go deeper into some things that are going on in the EU as well. For now, that is all from me. Thank you for joining. Please consider liking and subscribing, and I will see you on the next one.